Captain Marcus Thorne had served the royal family of Eldoria for 12 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he witnessed that cold October evening. As head of Queen Consort Isabella's personal security detail, he was privy to many private moments. But this conversation would change everything he thought he knew about the royal family. The Queen Consort had dismissed her usual attendants early that night, claiming she needed privacy to handle some delicate family matters. Marcus positioned himself outside her private study, as protocol demanded, when he heard voices rising from within the room. What started as a quiet discussion between Queen Isabella and someone Marcus couldn't initially identify soon escalated into something far more serious. Through the heavy oak door, Marcus could hear Queen Isabella's voice, normally soft and measured, taking on an edge he had never heard before. She was speaking to someone about financial arrangements, political favors, and something about covering up a scandal that could destroy the monarchy if it ever came to light. The conversation grew more intense as the unknown person seemed to be threatening the Queen Consort with exposure unless certain demands were met. Marcus found himself in an impossible position. His duty was to protect the royal family, but what he was hearing suggested something deeply wrong was happening within the very institution he had sworn to serve. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with details emerging about secret payments to foreign governments, manipulation of trade agreements, and the deliberate suppression of information that could help the kingdom's struggling economy. As the voices grew louder, Marcus realized he recognized the second voice. It belonged to Lord Chancellor William Ashford, the king's most trusted advisor, and the man who essentially ran the day-to-day operations of the government. The revelation that the Queen Consort and the Lord Chancellor were involved in something questionable sent a chill down Marcus's spine. These were the two people, aside from King Edmund himself, who held the most power in the kingdom. The conversation took an even darker turn when Lord Ashford mentioned a journalist who had been asking uncomfortable questions about the royal family's finances. Queen Isabella's response was swift and cold, suggesting that the journalist needed to be silenced permanently. The casual way they discussed ruining someone's career, and possibly their life, made Marcus realize he was witnessing something that went far beyond political maneuvering. When Queen Isabella mentioned that they had recordings of several high-ranking officials in compromising situations, Marcus understood the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about one scandal or cover-up. It was about a systematic network of blackmail and corruption that reached the highest levels of government. The Queen Consort and Lord Ashford were using their positions to control politicians, judges, and business leaders throughout the kingdom. As the meeting concluded, Marcus heard footsteps approaching the door. He quickly moved to a more natural position, pretending to conduct his regular security patrol. Lord Ashford emerged first, his face stern and focused. He barely acknowledged Marcus's presence as he strode down the corridor, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. Queen Isabella appeared moments later, composed and elegant as always, but Marcus could see something cold and calculating in her eyes that he had never noticed before. The Queen Consort paused when she saw Marcus, studying his face carefully. For a moment, he worried that she somehow knew he had been listening, but she simply nodded and wished him a good evening before retiring to her chambers. As she walked away, Marcus realized that his entire world had just shifted. The people he had sworn to protect were the very people who were betraying the trust of the entire kingdom. Over the following days, Marcus found himself watching Queen Isabella and Lord Ashford with new eyes. He began to notice patterns in their behavior, private meetings that weren't on any official schedule, and visitors who came and went through secret entrances. The more he observed, the more convinced he became that what he had overheard was just the tip of a much larger conspiracy. The weight of his knowledge began to affect Marcus's daily life. He found himself questioning every order, every protocol, and every decision that came from the royal family. His fellow guards began to notice his distraction and asked if everything was all right, but Marcus couldn't bring himself to share what he knew. The implications were too enormous and the potential consequences too severe. As weeks passed, Marcus learned more about the extent of the corruption. Through careful observation and discreet inquiries, he discovered that the scandal involved military contracts being awarded to companies owned by the Queen Consort's family, environmental regulations being weakened to benefit certain industries, and foreign aid being diverted to private accounts. The kingdom's resources were being systematically plundered by the very people entrusted to protect them. The breaking point came when Marcus witnessed Queen Isabella meeting with Viktor Petrov, a known arms dealer who had been banned from entering the kingdom 5 years earlier. The meeting took place in the Queen's private garden, away from official photographers and records. Marcus watched from a concealed position as documents and what appeared to be a substantial amount of cash changed hands. The realization that the Queen consort was dealing directly with criminals made Marcus understand that he could no longer remain silent. That night, Marcus made a decision that would change his life forever. He activated a small recording device that he carried as part of his security equipment and positioned himself where he could clearly hear Queen Isabella's next private meeting. The conversation that followed provided him with concrete evidence of the corruption he had suspected. Names were mentioned, specific amounts of money were discussed, and plans for future illegal activities were laid out in detail. As he listened to Queen Isabella and Lord Ashford plan their next moves, Marcus realized that they were not just stealing from the kingdom, they were actively working to undermine its stability for their own benefit. Foreign governments were being given access to classified information in exchange for personal payments, and domestic policies were being shaped to benefit a small group of wealthy individuals rather than the citizens of Eldoria. The recording captured Queen Isabella's voice clearly as she discussed her plans to eliminate anyone who might threaten their operation. The cold calculation in her voice as she talked about destroying lives and careers made Marcus realize that he was dealing with people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. The woman he had sworn to protect with his life was a threat to everything he believed in. With the evidence in his possession, Marcus faced an impossible choice. He could remain silent and continue to serve people he now knew were criminals, or he could expose the truth and face the consequences. Either way, his life would never be the same. The recording in his pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds as he considered what to do next. The final decision came when Marcus learned that Queen Isabella and Lord Ashford were planning to implement policies that would severely impact the kingdom's most vulnerable citizens. Tax increases that would disproportionately affect the poor, cuts to healthcare and education, and the selling of public lands to private developers. All of these measures were designed to generate funds that would ultimately end up in private accounts rather than benefiting the kingdom. Marcus knew that exposing the truth would likely end his career and possibly put his life in danger, but he also knew that he couldn't stand by and watch his country be destroyed from within. The oath he had taken as a royal guard was to protect the kingdom and its people, not just the individuals who happened to wear crowns. With trembling hands, he made copies of his recording and began to plan how he would bring the truth to light. The young captain understood that once he took this step, there would be no turning back. The powerful people he was about to expose would use every resource at their disposal to destroy him and discredit his evidence. But as he looked out at the kingdom he loved, Marcus knew that some things were more important than personal safety. The truth had to come out, no matter what the cost. Marcus spent 3 sleepless nights weighing his options after making the recording. The evidence he possessed was explosive enough to bring down the monarchy, but he understood the magnitude of what he was considering. Every scenario he imagined ended with devastating consequences, either for himself or for the kingdom he loved. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, as he realized that the future of Eldoria might rest in his hands. His first instinct was to approach King Edmund directly, hoping that the monarch was unaware of his wife's activities. Marcus had always believed that King Edmund was an honorable man who genuinely cared about his people. Perhaps if the king knew what was happening, he could put a stop to it internally without the need for public exposure. However, as Marcus considered this option more carefully, he began to have doubts about whether the king could truly be unaware of such extensive corruption happening within his own household. The more Marcus thought about it, the more he realized that Queen Isabella's activities would have required significant resources and coordination. Bank accounts had to be established, meetings had to be arranged, and documents had to be processed. All of this would have required the involvement of multiple people within the royal administration. The scope of the operation suggested that either King Edmund was complicit, or the royal household was so poorly managed that his wife could carry out massive financial crimes without his knowledge. Marcus decided to conduct his own discreet investigation before taking any action. Using his security clearance and knowledge of the palace's inner workings, he began to look for patterns and connections that might reveal the full extent of the conspiracy. What he discovered over the following weeks painted an even more disturbing picture than he had initially imagined. The corruption wasn't limited to Queen Isabella and Lord Ashford. Marcus found evidence of involvement from several high-ranking ministers, military commanders, and even some members of the royal family's extended circle. Bank records that he managed to access through contacts in the security services showed a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts that had been moving money out of the kingdom for years. The revelation that hit Marcus hardest was discovering that some of the kingdom's recent military deployments had been influenced by these corrupt dealings. Soldiers had been sent into harm's way not to protect Eldoria's interests, but to advance the private business dealings of Queen Isabella and her associates. Young men and women had died in conflicts that served no purpose other than to enrich the very people who had sent them to fight. As Marcus delved deeper into his investigation, he began to understand why Queen Isabella felt so confident in her activities. The network of blackmail and corruption she had built gave her leverage over almost everyone in positions of power. Judges who might investigate financial crimes were compromised by their own indiscretions. Politicians who might call for reforms were silenced by threats of exposure. Even some members of the press had been bought or intimidated into silence. The breakthrough in Marcus's investigation came when he discovered a second recording device that had been hidden in Lord Ashford's office. The device had been placed there months earlier by someone else who had apparently suspected wrongdoing. When Marcus retrieved and listened to the recordings, he found hours of conversations that provided even more damaging evidence of the conspiracy. These additional recordings revealed that the corruption extended beyond financial crimes into matters of national security. Queen Isabella and Lord Ashford had been selling classified information to foreign governments, compromising military operations and diplomatic negotiations. They had also been manipulating intelligence reports to justify policy decisions that benefited their business interests, even when those decisions put the kingdom at risk. One particularly disturbing conversation revealed that Queen Isabella had been working with foreign agents to destabilize neighboring kingdoms, creating conflicts that would benefit arms dealers and contractors connected to her network. The casual way she discussed orchestrating wars and manipulating international relations showed a level of callousness that shocked Marcus to his core. With this additional evidence, Marcus realized that he was dealing with something far more serious than simple corruption. Queen Isabella and her associates were committing acts of treason that threatened not only Eldoria's financial stability, but its very sovereignty. The foreign governments that were paying for classified information were using it to gain strategic advantages that could eventually be used against Eldoria itself. The weight of this knowledge began to take a serious toll on Marcus's health and mental state. He found himself unable to sleep, constantly looking over his shoulder, and jumping at every unexpected sound. The stress of carrying such explosive secrets while continuing to perform his duties as if nothing was wrong began to affect his performance, and his superior officers started asking questions about his behavior. Marcus knew that he couldn't maintain his facade much longer. The evidence he had gathered was too important to keep secret, and the longer he waited, the more damage Queen Isabella and her associates could do to the kingdom. However, he also understood that exposing the truth would require careful planning and consideration of the potential consequences. The first challenge Marcus faced was determining who he could trust with the information. The corruption network was so extensive that he couldn't be certain that any official channels were safe. Government ministers, military commanders, and even some members of the royal guard might be compromised. Going to the wrong person could result in his evidence being suppressed and his own life being put in danger. After careful consideration, Marcus decided that his best option was to approach the press directly. While some journalists had been compromised, he knew of several independent news organizations that had maintained their integrity despite pressure from the government. These outlets had the resources and expertise needed to verify his evidence and present it to the public in a way that would be difficult for the authorities to suppress. Marcus chose Sarah Chen, an investigative journalist known for her integrity and her willingness to take on powerful interests. Sarah had previously exposed corruption in the business world and had a reputation for being thorough and fair in her reporting. She also had connections to international news organizations that could help ensure the story would be published even if domestic outlets were pressured to suppress it. The decision to contact Sarah was not made lightly. Marcus understood that once he reached out to a journalist, he would be crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. He would be betraying the trust that had been placed in him as a royal guard, and he would be putting himself at enormous personal risk. However, he also knew that his oath as a guard was ultimately to protect the kingdom and its people. not to enable those who would harm them. Marcus arranged to meet Sarah at a small cafe in the old quarter of the capital, far from the palace and the areas where he might be recognized. He chose a time when he was officially off duty and used several counter-surveillance techniques he had learned during his security training to ensure he wasn't being followed. The meeting location was selected because it had multiple exit routes and was in an area with enough foot traffic to provide cover. When Marcus approached Sarah at the cafe, he could see the curiosity and skepticism in her eyes. As a royal guard reaching out to an investigative journalist, he knew he looked like either a valuable source or a potential trap. Sarah had obviously done her research on him before agreeing to the meeting, and she seemed prepared for the possibility that he might be working on behalf of the authorities to entrap her. Marcus began the conversation by explaining his position and his reasons for making contact. He emphasized that he was not acting out of personal grievance or seeking financial gain, but out of a genuine concern for the welfare of the kingdom. He explained that he had discovered evidence of serious criminal activity involving the highest levels of government and felt a moral obligation to bring it to light. Sarah listened carefully as Marcus outlined what he had discovered, asking pointed questions to test the credibility of his claims and his evidence. She was particularly interested in the recordings he had made and the additional evidence he had gathered through his investigation. When Marcus played portions of the recordings for her, Sarah's expression changed from skepticism to shock as she realized the magnitude of what he was revealing. The journalist explained that stories of this importance required extensive verification and corroboration before they could be published. She would need to examine all of Marcus's evidence in detail, conduct her own investigation to confirm the claims, and potentially seek additional sources who could provide supporting information. The process could take weeks or even months, during which time Marcus would need to continue his duties as normal while living with the knowledge that he had already set events in motion that could change everything. Sarah also warned Marcus about the personal risks he was taking by coming forward. People who exposed corruption at this level often faced retaliation that could include criminal charges, financial ruin, and even physical harm. The powerful individuals he was accusing would use every resource at their disposal to discredit him and suppress the story. She wanted to be certain that he understood the full implications of what he was doing and was prepared for the consequences. Despite the warnings, Marcus confirmed his commitment to seeing the truth revealed. He provided Sarah with copies of all his evidence and agreed to continue gathering additional information that might support the story. They established secure communication protocols that would allow them to stay in contact without detection, and Sarah began the painstaking process of verifying the explosive allegations that Marcus had brought to her. Sarah Chen spent the following 3 weeks conducting the most thorough investigation of her career. The evidence Marcus had provided was extensive, but she knew that accusations of this magnitude required absolute verification. Every recording had to be authenticated, every financial transaction had to be traced, and every claim had to be supported by multiple sources. The future of the kingdom and the lives of everyone involved depended on getting the story exactly right. Working with a small team of trusted colleagues and technical experts, Sarah began the painstaking process of verifying the recordings Marcus had provided. Audio analysis confirmed that the voices belonged to Queen Isabella and Lord Ashford, and forensic examination showed that the recordings had not been manipulated or edited. The technical evidence was solid, but Sarah knew she needed more than just recordings to build a case that would withstand the inevitable challenges. The financial investigation proved to be even more complex than Sarah had anticipated. The network of shell companies and offshore accounts that Marcus had uncovered was just the beginning of a sophisticated money laundering operation that spanned multiple countries and involved dozens of individuals. Working with financial experts and investigative partners in other nations, Sarah began to trace the flow of money and identify the full scope of the conspiracy. What emerged from this investigation was a picture of corruption that went far beyond simple theft. Queen Isabella and her associates had created a shadow economy that was systematically draining resources from Eldoria while enriching a small group of insiders. Public contracts were being awarded to companies owned by members of the conspiracy. Environmental regulations were being weakened to benefit certain industries, and tax policies were being manipulated to create loopholes that allowed the wealthy to avoid their obligations. One of the most disturbing discoveries was that foreign aid money intended to help struggling populations in neighboring countries was being diverted to private accounts. Millions of dollars that should have been used for humanitarian purposes were instead funding the lavish lifestyles of Queen Isabella and her associates. The human cost of this corruption was staggering, as people in need were being denied assistance so that already wealthy individuals could become even richer. Sarah's investigation also revealed the extent of the blackmail network that Queen Isabella had built to protect her operation. Hidden cameras and recording devices had been placed in hotels, restaurants, and private clubs frequented by politicians, judges, and business leaders. Compromising information was being collected systematically and used to ensure silence and compliance from anyone who might threaten the conspiracy. The blackmail network explained why so many people in positions of authority seemed willing to look the other way when questionable decisions were made. It wasn't just that they were being paid off, they were being coerced through threats of exposure and professional destruction. The atmosphere of fear and intimidation that Queen Isabella had created meant that even honest officials were afraid to speak out or investigate suspicious activities. As Sarah delved deeper into the investigation, she began to uncover evidence that the corruption extended into the royal family itself. Bank records showed that King Edmund's personal accounts had received substantial transfers from some of the same shell companies that were being used to launder stolen money. While this didn't necessarily prove that the king was actively involved in the conspiracy, it raised serious questions about his knowledge and potential complicity. The discovery of the king's financial connections to the conspiracy created a dilemma for Sarah and her team. If King Edmund was truly unaware of his wife's activities, then exposing the financial connections could destroy an innocent man's reputation and potentially destabilize the monarchy unnecessarily. However, if he was complicit in the corruption, then his involvement was a crucial part of the story that had to be told. Sarah decided to approach several former palace employees who might have insight into the relationship between King Edmund and Queen Isabella. Through careful and discreet inquiries, she was able to interview 3 former staff members who provided important context for understanding the dynamics within the royal household. Their accounts painted a picture of a king who had become increasingly isolated from day-to-day operations, and had delegated significant authority to his wife and Lord Ashford. According to these sources, King Edmund had been suffering from health problems that weren't publicly known and had been relying heavily on Queen Isabella to manage many aspects of royal business. The king's trust in his wife and his chief advisor was absolute, and he rarely questioned their decisions or asked for detailed explanations of their activities. This information suggested that while the king might not have been actively involved in the corruption, his negligence had created the conditions that allowed it to flourish. During this period, Marcus continued his duties at the palace, while secretly gathering additional information for Sarah's investigation. The stress of maintaining his normal routine while conducting covert surveillance was taking a serious toll on his mental and physical health. He had lost weight, developed chronic insomnia, and found himself becoming increasingly paranoid about being discovered. The breakthrough that Marcus had been hoping for came when he managed to access Queen Isabella's private computer during a period when she was away from the palace. Using skills he had learned during his security training, Marcus was able to bypass the computer's security systems and download thousands of emails, documents, and financial records. The information he obtained provided Sarah with the missing pieces of her investigation and confirmed many of the suspicions that had emerged from their previous work. The emails were particularly damaging because they showed Queen Isabella's direct involvement in planning and coordinating criminal activities. In her own words, she discussed bribing government officials, manipulating policy decisions, and using her position to benefit her business associates. The casual way she discussed these illegal activities in writing demonstrated a level of arrogance and confidence that suggested she believed she was untouchable. One email thread that particularly shocked Sarah involved Queen Isabella's correspondence with Victor Petrov, the arms dealer that Marcus had seen her meeting with in the palace gardens. The emails revealed that Queen Isabella had been providing Petrov with classified information about military contracts and strategic planning in exchange for substantial payments. This information had then been used to manipulate arms deals and create artificial conflicts that benefited Petrov's business. Another series of emails showed Queen Isabella coordinating with foreign intelligence services to provide them with sensitive information about Eldoria's diplomatic and military activities. In exchange for this information, she was receiving payments that were being laundered through the network of shell companies that Sarah had already identified. The scope of this treasonous activity was breathtaking, and the potential damage to national security was incalculable. As Sarah's investigation neared completion, she faced the challenge of presenting her findings in a way that would be credible and compelling to the public. The story was incredibly complex, with multiple layers of corruption, financial fraud, and treason that had been carefully concealed for years. She needed to present the information in a way that would be understandable to ordinary citizens, while still maintaining the detailed documentation necessary to prove her claims. Sarah also had to consider the potential consequences of publishing the story. The revelations about Queen Isabella would likely destroy the monarchy and create a constitutional crisis that could destabilize the entire country. Foreign governments that had been receiving classified information might use the chaos to advance their own interests at Eldoria's expense. The economic disruption caused by the exposure of the financial crimes could trigger a recession that would hurt innocent citizens. Despite these concerns, Sarah knew that the truth had to be told. The corruption that Marcus had uncovered was not just a betrayal of public trust. It was an ongoing threat to the sovereignty and security of the kingdom. Every day that the conspiracy continued, more damage was being done to Eldoria's institutions and its people. The short-term chaos that might result from exposure was preferable to allowing the systematic destruction of the country to continue. Working with her editors and legal team, Sarah prepared a comprehensive exposé that would be published simultaneously by multiple news organizations to prevent suppression. The story would include audio excerpts from the recordings, reproductions of key documents, and detailed explanations of the financial transactions that proved the corruption. Expert analysis would be provided to help readers understand the implications of the revelations and the potential consequences for the kingdom. As the publication date approached, Sarah reached out to Marcus for one final meeting. She wanted to give him the opportunity to review the story before it was published, and to ensure that he was prepared for what would happen once the truth became public. The moment the story was published, Marcus's role as a whistleblower would become known, and he would face immediate retaliation from those he had exposed. During their meeting, Sarah explained that she had arranged for Marcus to have protection from an international human rights organization that specialized in protecting whistleblowers. She had also contacted law enforcement agencies in other countries who might be able to provide asylum if Marcus's life was threatened. The preparations were necessary because the people Marcus was exposing had demonstrated their willingness to use violence to protect their interests. Marcus listened to Sarah's precautions with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. He had known from the beginning that exposing the truth would come at a personal cost, but the reality of what he was about to face was still overwhelming. His career was over. His reputation would be destroyed by those seeking to discredit him, and his safety could not be guaranteed. Yet as he thought about the alternative, allowing the corruption to continue unchecked, he knew that he had made the right choice. The final decision to proceed with publication was made jointly by Sarah and her editorial team after consulting with legal experts and security specialists. They had done everything possible to verify the accuracy of their reporting and to prepare for the consequences that would follow. The story would be published in 3 days, giving them time to make final preparations and to ensure that all security measures were in place to protect both Marcus and the journalistic team. The story broke simultaneously across 5 major news outlets at precisely 6 in the morning, ensuring maximum impact and making suppression impossible. Sarah Chen's months of investigation culminated in a comprehensive exposé titled The Crown's Shadow: How Queen Isabella Built an Empire of Corruption. The headlines dominated every news cycle across the globe, sending shockwaves through Eldoria and the international community. Within minutes of publication, the royal palace was in complete chaos. Phone lines were jammed with calls from journalists, government officials, and foreign diplomats demanding answers. Queen Isabella's private secretary found herself fielding hundreds of inquiries about allegations that seemed too explosive to be true. The carefully maintained facade of royal dignity crumbled as the full scope of the corruption became public knowledge. King Edmund was awakened by his chief of staff at dawn and presented with printed copies of the news reports. The monarch's initial reaction was disbelief and anger, assuming that the stories were part of an elaborate smear campaign designed to damage the royal family. However, as he read through the detailed evidence and listened to audio excerpts from the recordings, the color drained from his face as he realized that the allegations against his wife were not only credible, but thoroughly documented. The audio recordings proved to be the most damaging evidence, as they featured Queen Isabella's own voice discussing illegal activities with Lord Ashford. News broadcasts played carefully edited excerpts that captured the most incriminating statements while protecting the privacy of other individuals who might have been mentioned in the recordings. The sound of the Queen Consort casually discussing bribery, blackmail, and treason in her own words made denial impossible. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Crowds began gathering outside the palace gates within hours of the story's publication, with protesters demanding answers and calling for the Queen's immediate arrest. The demonstrations were largely peaceful at first, but the anger and sense of betrayal felt by ordinary citizens was palpable. Many people held signs reading, "We trusted you," and "How much did you steal?" as they called for justice. Parliamentary leaders were forced to convene an emergency session to address the crisis. Opposition politicians, who had been silenced by Queen Isabella's blackmail network, suddenly found their voices, calling for immediate investigations and criminal prosecutions. The revelation that so many government officials had been compromised explained why previous attempts to investigate royal finances had been unsuccessful, and why certain policy decisions had seemed to benefit wealthy interests at the expense of ordinary citizens. Queen Isabella's initial response was to issue a brief statement through her lawyers denying all allegations and claiming that the recordings were fabricated. However, the forensic analysis that Sarah's team had conducted made such claims impossible to sustain. Multiple independent experts had verified the authenticity of the audio evidence, and the financial records provided a clear paper trail that corroborated the conversations captured in the recordings. Lord Ashford proved to be more pragmatic in his response to the exposure. Recognizing that the evidence against him was overwhelming, he immediately retained criminal defense lawyers and began cooperating with investigators in hopes of securing more favorable treatment. His willingness to provide information about other conspirators led to a cascade of revelations that implicated dozens of additional individuals in the corruption network. The international implications of the scandal were enormous. Foreign governments that had been receiving classified information from Queen Isabella found themselves in the awkward position of either admitting their involvement or claiming ignorance of the source of their intelligence. Several diplomatic relationships were severely strained as evidence emerged, showing how Eldoria's national interests had been compromised for personal financial gain. Marcus found himself at the center of a media storm that he was completely unprepared to handle. Within hours of the story's publication, his identity as the whistleblower became known, and journalists were camped outside his apartment building seeking interviews. The security measures that Sarah had arranged proved essential, as Marcus received numerous threatening phone calls and messages from people seeking to intimidate him into recanting his testimony. The Royal Guard attempted to arrest Marcus for breaching his oath of loyalty and violating security protocols, but he had already been moved to a safe location with the help of the international human rights organization that Sarah had contacted. His former colleagues were divided in their reactions to his revelations, with some viewing him as a traitor, while others privately acknowledged that he had done the right thing by exposing the corruption. The financial markets reacted swiftly and severely to the news of the scandal. Eldoria's currency lost 15% of its value in the first day of trading following the revelations, and government bonds were downgraded by international credit rating agencies. The economic damage caused by years of corruption was becoming apparent as investors lost confidence in the kingdom's institutions and governance. As more details emerged from the ongoing investigation, the true scope of the conspiracy became clear. The corruption network had been operating for nearly a decade, systematically draining resources from every sector of government. Healthcare programs had been underfunded so that money could be diverted to private accounts. Military readiness had been compromised by the sale of classified information to foreign powers. Environmental protection had been weakened to benefit industries connected to Queen Isabella's associates. The revelation that humanitarian aid had been stolen proved particularly damaging to the royal family's reputation. Images of suffering populations in neighboring countries who had been denied assistance because their aid money was funding Queen Isabella's luxury lifestyle generated international outrage. Human rights organizations called for criminal charges to be filed, not just for theft, but for crimes against humanity given the impact of the stolen aid on vulnerable populations. King Edmund found himself facing an impossible situation. His wife was clearly guilty of serious crimes. but prosecuting her would likely mean the end of the monarchy itself. Public trust in the institution had been shattered, and calls for the abolition of the royal family were growing louder each day. The king's own financial connections to the conspiracy, while potentially innocent, created additional complications that made his position increasingly untenable. The pressure on King Edmund intensified when additional recordings surfaced showing Queen Isabella discussing plans to manipulate the succession to ensure that her allies would remain in power even after King Edmund's death. The conversations revealed that she had been planning to eliminate potential rivals and install puppet rulers who would continue to serve her interests. The casual way she discussed undermining the constitutional order demonstrated that her corruption went beyond simple greed to encompass a fundamental assault on democratic institutions. Parliament moved quickly to establish a special prosecutor's office with authority to investigate and prosecute crimes related to the royal corruption scandal. The appointment of a respected former judge to lead the investigation helped restore some public confidence in the legal process, but many citizens remained skeptical that justice would truly be served. Previous attempts to investigate powerful individuals had been undermined by the very corruption network that was now exposed. International pressure on Eldoria to address the scandal intensified when evidence emerged that Queen Isabella's activities had contributed to instability in neighboring regions. The arms-dealing network that she had supported had fueled conflicts that resulted in thousands of casualties and millions of refugees. Foreign governments demanded that Eldoria take responsibility for its role in these tragedies and provide reparations for the damage caused. The scandal also exposed the failure of oversight mechanisms that should have detected and prevented such extensive corruption. Banking regulators who should have noticed suspicious financial transactions had been compromised by bribes or blackmail. Government auditors who should have identified discrepancies in public accounts had been intimidated into silence. The systematic breakdown of institutional safeguards demonstrated how corruption could metastasize when left unchecked. As the immediate shock of the revelations began to subside, attention turned to the question of how to rebuild trust in Eldoria's institutions. Many citizens demanded not just punishment for those who had committed crimes, but fundamental reforms to prevent similar corruption in the future. Proposals ranged from constitutional changes that would limit royal power to the establishment of independent oversight bodies with real authority to investigate government activities. The international community watched the unfolding crisis with great interest, as the Eldoria scandal had implications far beyond the kingdom's borders. The revelation that classified information had been sold to foreign powers raised questions about the security of intelligence shared between allied nations. The exposure of the arms-dealing network prompted investigations in multiple countries about similar corruption in their own governments. For Marcus, the publication of the story marked the end of one chapter of his life and the beginning of another. The young captain, who had sworn an oath to protect the royal family, had become the man who brought down a corrupt queen. The personal cost had been enormous. But as he watched the investigation unfold and saw evidence of the crimes being systematically exposed, he knew that his decision to speak out had been justified. The coming weeks would bring trials, investigations, and potentially the end of the monarchy itself. But the truth was finally out, and the long process of rebuilding Eldoria's damaged institutions could begin. Marcus had kept his oath to protect the kingdom, even when doing so meant betraying those he had sworn to serve. 6 months after the explosive revelations, Eldoria was a fundamentally different kingdom. The trials of Queen Isabella and her co-conspirators had dominated headlines around the world, providing a daily reminder of how far the corruption had reached and how much damage had been done to the nation's institutions. The special prosecutor's investigation had uncovered evidence of crimes that went far beyond what even Marcus had originally suspected. Queen Isabella's trial became one of the most watched legal proceedings in modern history. The former queen consort, stripped of her titles and royal privileges, sat in a criminal dock facing charges of treason, money laundering, bribery, and conspiracy. The evidence against her was overwhelming, but her legal team's strategy of claiming that she had acted under the influence of Lord Ashford and other male advisors generated significant controversy and debate about power dynamics within the royal family. The trial revealed additional shocking details about the extent of Queen Isabella's criminal network. Testimony from cooperating witnesses showed that she had been planning to assassinate several political opponents who posed threats to her operation. Evidence presented in court demonstrated that environmental disasters that had killed dozens of people were the direct result of safety regulations being weakened in exchange for bribes. The human cost of her corruption became impossible to ignore. Lord Ashford's decision to cooperate with prosecutors proved devastating to the remaining conspirators. His detailed testimony provided investigators with roadmaps to hidden assets, secret communications, and previously unknown criminal activities. In exchange for his cooperation, he received a reduced sentence of 25 years in prison, though many citizens felt that even this punishment was insufficient given the scope of his crimes. King Edmund's position became increasingly precarious as the trials proceeded. While prosecutors had not found evidence that he was actively involved in his wife's criminal activities, his failure to detect or prevent the corruption raised serious questions about his fitness to rule. Public opinion polls showed that less than 30% of citizens believed the monarchy should continue, and calls for his abdication grew louder each day. The king's decision to voluntarily dissolve the monarchy came as a surprise to many observers, though those close to the royal family had seen it coming for weeks. In a televised address to the nation, King Edmund took full responsibility for the failure of oversight that had allowed the corruption to flourish. He announced that he would abdicate immediately, and that a national referendum would be held to determine whether Eldoria would transition to a republican form of government. The constitutional crisis created by the monarchy's dissolution required rapid action from Parliament to ensure continued governance. Emergency legislation was passed to transfer the king's powers to a provisional government led by the Prime Minister until new constitutional arrangements could be established. International observers praised the peaceful nature of the transition, noting that many countries had experienced violence and instability during similar political upheavals. Marcus found himself in the unexpected position of being hailed as a national hero. The former royal guard who had risked everything to expose the truth was invited to testify before Parliament about the reforms needed to prevent future corruption. His recommendations included strengthening oversight mechanisms, improving transparency in government finances, and establishing independent institutions with real power to investigate wrongdoing. The personal cost of his whistleblowing remained significant, however. Marcus had been forced to relocate to another country for his safety, as some supporters of the former queen continued to view him as a traitor who had brought down the monarchy. Death threats and harassment continued even after Queen Isabella's conviction, requiring ongoing security measures that severely limited his freedom of movement. Sarah Chen received international recognition for her investigative journalism, winning several prestigious awards for her role in exposing the corruption scandal. However, she remained focused on continuing her investigation into the international dimensions of the conspiracy. Her work revealed similar corruption networks in several other countries, suggesting that Queen Isabella's activities were part of a broader pattern of abuse by powerful individuals around the world. The recovery of stolen assets became a major focus of the new government's efforts to restore public trust and repair the damage caused by the corruption. International cooperation was essential to this process, as much of the stolen money had been hidden in offshore accounts beyond Eldoria's reach. Several countries agreed to freeze and return assets that could be proven to have been stolen from Eldoria's treasury. The humanitarian aid that had been stolen was particularly difficult to recover, as much of it had already been spent on luxury goods and services. However, the new government established a victims' compensation fund, using recovered assets and additional budget allocations to provide assistance to the populations that had been denied aid due to Queen Isabella's theft. While this couldn't undo the suffering that had already occurred, it represented a commitment to making amends for past wrongs. The trials of lower-level conspirators continued for more than a year, revealing the full scope of the corruption network. Government officials, military officers, business leaders, and even some journalists were convicted of various crimes related to the conspiracy. The systematic prosecution of all those involved sent a clear message that corruption would no longer be tolerated at any level of government. The constitutional referendum that King Edmund had promised was held 18 months after his abdication. Citizens voted overwhelmingly to establish a republican government with a strong presidency and an independent judiciary. The new constitution included numerous safeguards designed to prevent the concentration of power and ensure transparency in government operations. International observers praised the document as a model for democratic governance. The first presidential election under the new constitution was won by Margaret Torres, a former Supreme Court justice who had been known for her integrity and independence. Her campaign focused on rebuilding trust in government institutions and ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Her election was seen as a vindication of the democratic process and proof that Eldoria could successfully transition from monarchy to republic. The economic recovery from the corruption scandal took several years but was ultimately successful. International confidence in Eldoria's institutions was gradually restored as the new government demonstrated its commitment to transparency and good governance. The country's economy actually became stronger than it had been under the monarchy, as resources that had previously been diverted to corrupt purposes were redirected toward productive investments in infrastructure, education, and healthcare. The new government established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to fully document the extent of the corruption and ensure that the historical record accurately reflected what had occurred. The commission's work helped the country come to terms with the betrayal they had experienced and provided a foundation for moving forward. Marcus testified before the commission, providing additional details about his experiences and the process that had led him to expose the truth. Queen Isabella was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a punishment that reflected both the severity of her crimes and the need for justice to be seen to be done. She remained defiant throughout her trial and continued to claim innocence even after her conviction. Her refusal to show remorse or acknowledge the harm she had caused made it impossible for many citizens to forgive her, ensuring that her legacy would be one of betrayal and corruption. The international community's response to Eldoria's transformation was largely positive. The peaceful transition from monarchy to republic was cited as an example of how democratic institutions could adapt to changing circumstances and overcome even serious crises. Several countries facing their own corruption scandals looked to Eldoria's experience for guidance on how to restore public trust and rebuild damaged institutions. Marcus eventually returned to Eldoria after the security situation stabilized, though he chose not to return to government service. Instead, he established a foundation dedicated to protecting whistleblowers and promoting transparency in government. His work helped other individuals who found themselves in similar situations to the one he had faced, providing them with legal support, security assistance, and advocacy for their protection. The foundation also worked to promote reforms in other countries that would make it easier for government employees to report corruption without fear of retaliation. Marcus's experience had shown both the importance of individuals being willing to speak out against wrongdoing and the need for better protection mechanisms to ensure that those who do come forward are not destroyed in the process. Looking back on the events that had transformed his life and his country, Marcus reflected on the lessons that could be learned from the experience. The corruption scandal had demonstrated how quickly democratic institutions could be undermined when oversight mechanisms failed and when those in power were allowed to operate without accountability. It had also shown, however, that truth and justice could ultimately prevail when individuals were willing to take personal risks to defend the public interest. The story of Queen Isabella's downfall became a cautionary tale that was studied in schools and universities around the world. It illustrated how corruption could grow from small beginnings into a systemic threat to democratic governance, and how ordinary individuals could play crucial roles in defending their countries against such threats. Most importantly, it showed that no one, regardless of their position or power, was above the law when citizens were vigilant and institutions were strong. Years later, as Eldoria celebrated the anniversary of its transition to democracy, Marcus was honored for his role in exposing the corruption that had threatened the very foundations of the country. Standing before a crowd of thousands, he reminded them that democracy was not something that could be taken for granted, but something that required constant vigilance and the courage to speak truth to power. His words served as both a celebration of what had been achieved and a warning about the ongoing responsibility that came with freedom.